placer estar aquí y darles la bienvenida a la primera sesión temática de la Plataforma Global 2022 para la reducción de desastres, enfocada en el mejoramiento de la comprensión y la gobernanza del riesgo sistémico, desempaquetando el Informe de Evaluación Global 2022, tradicionalmente conocido como GAR. También quiero, por supuesto, darle la más cordial bienvenida a todos los participantes, colegas y amigos de los diversos rincones del mundo que se unen en línea hasta Bali el día de hoy. Mi nombre es Iracema Alcántara Ayala y realizo investigación integral del riesgo de desastres en la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. Tengo el honor de ser integrante del grupo asesor científico y técnico de la Oficina Regional de UNDRR para las Américas y el Caribe y del Consejo de Liderazgo Científico de la Iniciativa de Investigación de Montañas. Tuve asimismo el placer de liderar el capítulo 4 del GAR, que aborda el tema de cómo las elecciones humanas impulsan la vulnerabilidad, la exposición y el riesgo de desastres. El GAR 2022 subraya que nuestro mundo está en riesgo. En el informe del IPCC, del Grupo de Trabajo sobre Impactos, Adaptación y Vulnerabilidad, publicado a principios de este año, los científicos del clima advirtieron que ya estamos comprometidamente cerca de puntos de inflexión que podrían conducir a impactos climáticos en cascada e irreversibles. Las decisiones humanas sobre cómo vivimos, qué construimos y para qué invertimos tienen una enorme influencia en la forma que estamos de manera permanente creando el riesgo de desastre, lo cual al mismo tiempo inmoviliza el desarrollo sostenible, deteriora la resiliencia, así como nuestra capacidad para adaptarnos al cambio climático. El GAR también señala el vínculo insoslayable entre la reducción del riesgo de desastres y el desarrollo sostenible, ya que nada erosiona el desarrollo sostenible de la forma en que lo hacen los desastres, como subrayó la secretaria general adjunta de la Organización de las Naciones Unidas, Amina Mohamed, durante el lanzamiento del GAR 2022 en nombre de la ONU en Nueva York. Este GAR ofrece recomendaciones sobre cómo se puede reducir el riesgo y prevenir los desastres al influir en la forma en que los gobiernos, las empresas y las personas toman decisiones sobre el riesgo. Es decir, de manera sintética, ¿qué decisiones y acciones son necesarias para detener la espiral y construir comunidades resilientes a largo plazo? Ello implica que para tener un planeta sostenible, donde las personas y la sociedad en su conjunto prosperen, debemos transformar la manera en que pensamos y actuamos, y la forma en que se gobierna el territorio y el manejo de sus recursos para evitar así alimentar los impulsores del riesgo de desastre. La dinámica de la vulnerabilidad y la exposición, y por ende su gestión, están determinadas por arquitecturas y procesos locales que requieren el conocimiento de diferentes disciplinas y comunidades de actores académicos y no académicos, con la finalidad de crear sinergias con una visión integral sostenida para adoptar enfoques transdisciplinarios que estimulen la coproducción del conocimiento y fortalezcan que éste se traduzca en acción. Por ese motivo, uno de los mensajes del GAR es que debemos dejar de realizar investigación, formulación de políticas y toma de decisiones en silos o de manera aislada. La sesión técnica de hoy, la primera después de los diálogos de alto nivel, dará a conocer cómo se puede poner en práctica el llamado a la acción del informe de evaluación global. Las recomendaciones proporcionarán información para la revisión de mitad de periodo del marco de Sendai, pero también contribuirán a las discusiones sobre el Informe Mundial sobre el Desarrollo Sostenible 2023 y la COP27 sobre el Acuerdo de París, que se convocará a finales de este año en Egipto. Esta sesión es el preámbulo de la ejecución de las recomendaciones del GAR 2022 y es una oportunidad fundamental para comprender cómo se pueden implementar los resultados plasmados en el informe para fortalecer las capacidades de todos los actores frente a un panorama de riesgos que, como todos sabemos, es cada día más complejo. Debemos recordar y compartir con quienes aún todavía no lo comprenden que los desastres no son naturales y, por lo tanto, no se deben visualizar como un saldo trágico de la fuerza de la naturaleza. Los desastres son procesos sistémicos construidos socialmente que se desarrollan a lo largo del tiempo debido a interacciones e interdependencias complejas que se dan entre las esferas humana y natural. Esto es, los vínculos multidimensionales entre la vulnerabilidad, la exposición y los diversos tipos de amenazas. Las causas fundamentales o subyacentes de los desastres se derivan de las selecciones humanas y las condiciones estructurales implícitas en los modelos de desarrollo y crecimiento. Estas se ven exacerbadas por las preferencias y decisiones políticas, técnicas y de gestión en la forma en que se aborda el riesgo de desastres. No se puede comprender el riesgo si no se identifican las causas de fondo y los inductores del riesgo. Y tampoco se puede mejorar la gobernanza del riesgo si dichos factores no se abordan desde una perspectiva integral. Esta sesión temática contará con voces de profesionales que brindarán información sobre cómo el llamado del GAR 2022 se puede traducir en acción de acuerdo a diferentes perspectivas que abarcan desde iniciativas regionales hasta programas gubernamentales nacionales y acciones a nivel comunitario. Después de escuchar las diferentes perspectivas y puntos de vista de nuestro panel, daremos paso a una discusión abierta con los miembros de la audiencia, tanto los que se encuentran de manera presencial aquí en la sala, como los que se unen a nosotros en línea. Y ahora, permítanme por favor compartir con ustedes algunas indicaciones para guiar nuestra sesión de esta tarde. Si están viendo en línea esta transmisión y desean seguir la sesión en uno de los 6 idiomas de la ONU, pueden seleccionar el canal de idioma en el cuadro que se encuentra a la derecha de la ventana de video. Es importante silenciar el audio del reproductor de video, de lo contrario escucharán el idioma original más la interpretación. El código de la plataforma Slido que utilizaremos en esta sesión para las preguntas y que podamos interactuar en línea tiene el código 1326714. Lo repito, 1326714. A través de este código, el Lido, vamos a poder interactuar. Y sin más que agregar por el momento, demos inicio a este panel del día de hoy. Es para mí un gran placer presentar a nuestro primer conferencista magistral, Aromar Revi, quien establecerá el tono de nuestra sesión y pondrá en perspectiva el creciente riesgo sistémico y sus efectos en los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible. El señor Rabi tiene experiencia en desarrollo sostenible, política pública y gobernanza, asentamientos humanos, cambio ambiental y tecnológico mundial. Es autor principal y coordinador del IPCC y forma parte del Consejo Asesor del Informe de Evaluación Global de la UNDRR. Señor Revi, agradecemos sus conocimientos y planteamientos y le cedemos la palabra.
Thank you, Erisima. It's a pleasure to be here. Good afternoon, Excellencies, delegates, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. When a number of us launched the Global Assessment of Risk 22 report in New York a few weeks ago with the Deputy Secretary General and the SRSG, we really look forward to being here. So I'm really glad to see so many people here. And I will speak like I normally do, because I've been in the GAR sort of framework now for almost 14 years or so, since 2008. I'll speak rather frankly. So to start very frankly, we have less than 3,000 days to implement the Sustainable Development Goals, the Sendai Framework, and the Paris Climate Agreement. And we have to do this in tens of thousands, if not more, places across the world. That's the operational challenge that we face ahead of us after having seen a couple of very difficult years of COVID. As we approach 2023 and the stocktakes of major global agreements, we need to reflect on the post-COVID development pathways that we're on. And so, a few questions. Where have we come so far, and where do we need to go? What lessons can we learn from the global, regional, and local response to the COVID pandemic? How are we doing on the promise in SDGs of leaving no one, no place, and no ecosystem behind? Have we adequately considered the increasing impact of disaster risk on global systems and the achievement of the SDGs by the 2030s? And finally, how do we make the choices that limit everyday risk that we often forget about and enable transitions to climate-resilient development as that window of opportunity clearly narrows? So in response, sound disaster risk management and resilience building safeguard these hard-won gains in poverty reduction, livelihood security, universal access to health, education, water, sanitation, clean energy and infrastructure development, all sort of embodied in the SDGs. It also limits the creation of new risks, something that we've seen dramatically happening over the last couple of years, by limiting vulnerability and exposure, critically by implementing the SDGs. The other important thing is we need to limit the expansion of inequality that we've seen growing very dramatically, and ensuring that economic development that all countries in the world are looking forward is risk-informed, and critical ecosystem services are protected and conserved, as we saw the bounce back during COVID. In short, what we have in the GAR and the Sendai process is a bedrock on which prosperity and resilience can be built in these uncertain times. GAR22 reminds us that we must measure what we value, recognizing the worth not only of economic prosperity, but also of people and the planet. It looks upon us to examine how governance systems can evolve to better build resilience. In an age of complex and compounding risk with cascading impacts, we must break down siloed thinking within an all-of-society and an all-of-economy approach. Communities and people most affected by current impacts and future risk need to be at the heart of our planning, of our financing, and action. And we need to factor in how human beings make decisions about risk. Decisions should be based on science and evidence, complemented by rich data and digital technology, which is now increasingly available to people across the world. Within this, we also need to draw deeply on indigenous and traditional knowledges that add nuance and a deep understanding of the emerging challenges of the Anthropocene. Disruptions in the climate system, in the global hydrological cycles, large areas of our oceans, cryosphere, and ecosystems that are either dead or are dying, all created by our action as humans and often, unfortunately, because of short-term greed. Let us not be confused. These are not things that will happen to our grandchildren in faraway places. Many of us in this room and outside will live to see the impacts of our collective choices and actions if we don't act now and with much greater ambition, speed, and determination. We are now halfway through our self-determined journey to the SDGs. As we approach the review of our progress to date, GAR 2022, as also the previous GARs, offer valuable recommendations to tackle climate change and increase resilience all across the world. But what compass can we use to keep track of our progress in this space? I'm going to offer you something that might be a little controversial, but I think it's useful to examine where we are. We currently sit at about 400 medium-scale disasters a year. That's roughly about one a day. We are set to rise to over 550 medium-scale disasters a year, or 1.5 per day by the 2030s. This is one of the important findings of the GAR. We're also currently at 1.1 degrees centigrade of warming, measured as higher global air surface temperatures at the equator. Now, 1.1 degree warming is not that across the world. In many parts of the world, the temperatures are much higher. Towards the high latitudes, the elevations are probably between 3 and 4. In many of our cities, we've clearly breached the 2-degree limit because of urban heat islands. Hence, if you take these two facts together, we must work doubly hard to address 3 interrelated outcomes of systemic risk. And I'll lay them out for you simply and clearly. The first is that we have to limit the number of medium-sized disasters to less than 1.5 a day. Remember that number, 1.5? We've also got to limit emissions and global warming to well below 2 degrees centigrade, which is what Paris has committed us to, but ideally below 1.5. And yet, and this is an outcome of the IPCC latest reports that came out. I'm one of the lead authors of that process. The reality is we are set to actually achieve where Paris is taking us, which means that global average temperatures will almost certainly go beyond 1.5 and possibly increase beyond 3 degrees over the century. So that's the not so bad news. So again, I'll repeat those numbers. They're very simple to remember. Less than 1.5 events a day, that's where we need to get to. Keeping below 1.5 in terms of warming, but preparing adaptation, which is very closely linked to disaster risk reduction at 2.7 or so, so preparing for the worst. So basically, the uncertainty and scale of these wicked problems should not and cannot be a barrier to action. Sustainable development is a continuing process of adjusting our progress to our challenges, which, as we've seen in the COVID years, are continuously growing. So the systemic challenges of the 21st century require systemic thinking, coordination, and responses if we are to create in the common good, and I will outline that again, in the common good. It's not only about a common future, it's about the common good, a more sustainable, more resilient, and more equitable future for all of us, both in this room and among the poorest and most vulnerable communities in the world. Thank you very much. Back to you, Irasima.
Muchas gracias al señor Aromar Revi por compartir con nosotros estos comentarios de apertura. Ciertamente, la consecución de los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible involucra pensamientos, retos y compromisos de orden sistémico de toda la sociedad. Necesitamos una acción mayor y transversal para reducir la vulnerabilidad y la exposición y desarrollar la resiliencia de los individuos, de los sistemas de gobernanza, de los gobiernos y las comunidades. Los integrantes de la comunidad científica debemos reconocer que tenemos más libertades que los que están al servicio del gobierno y en la formulación de políticas. Por lo tanto, los científicos debemos persuadir a los políticos de que somos contrapartes instrumentales. Si logramos generar una relación de confianza entre los científicos y el ámbito de la formulación de políticas, los enfoques basados en la evidencia científica nos conducirán a nuevas oportunidades. Ahora tengo el placer de presentar a nuestro segundo conferencista magistral, el señor Ibrahim Cheikh Dione, quien hablará sobre cómo hacer que el financiamiento del riesgo sea accesible para las comunidades vulnerables con la finalidad de construir sistemas alimentarios sostenibles y contrarrestar los impactos del riesgo sistémico. El señor Cheikh Dione tiene más de 30 años de liderazgo profesional y experiencia en gestión en África, Estados Unidos de América, Europa y Asia. Anteriormente se desempeñaba como presidente de la firma de asesoría de inversión y administración con sede en Dakar, ACT Afrique Group, la cual fundó en 2012. Asimismo, el señor Cheikh Dione ocupó varios cargos de alto nivel: banquero senior de África en BNP en Londres, ministro, consejero especial y embajador extraordinario del presidente de la República de Senegal. Demos la bienvenida a las ideas y perspectivas del señor Cheikh Dione, para lo cual reproduciremos su mensaje de video. Adelante.
Hello. I would love to be in Bali and being part of this conversation for this important gathering. Nevertheless, I'm delighted for the opportunity to participate virtually. Climate change has been devastating around the world, with a human face that doesn't get talked about quite often. Africa is not an exception. For the past couple of years, we've seen the effect of drought in the Sahel, tropical cyclone in Madagascar and Mozambique, and lately flood in South Africa. To address these concerns, it requires investment, commitment, and leadership. With regard to leadership, that's why the African Union decided in 2012 to create the African Race Capacity, entirely dedicated to helping African countries to deal with the effect of climate change. What do? We provide support to our member states to plan, prepare, and respond to the effect of climate change. With regard to the planning side, which is the purpose of your conversation today, that's where we provide support for countries that could model their risk, develop early warning system, with the hope that government, by having access to that information, can decide either to return the risk or to transfer the risk to the international market, so that they can have access to additional resources for the early response, so they can save life and livelihood. What I just described to you, it's not a concept anymore for us. We've been around since 2012 and been quite impactful in our member states. About $1 billion provided to cover the risk associated with climate change in our member states. We protected up to 100 million people across Africa. So therefore, what I have just described, it's a sign that if we pull our resources together, our forces together, we can make Africa more resilient. We could do more. And that's why it's important we continue the course and consolidate what we've done so far for Africa and be able to protect the continent against the effect of climate change. But for that to happen, there's certain areas where Africa would require some help. And that is to build the capacity of the African government to develop an early warning system, modeling system, so we can actually understand better the effect of climate change in our countries. We can also do more by providing support to African countries so they can actually afford the premium required to transfer the risk to the international market, so we can mobilize additional resources. Now, COP27 is around the corner. This is the time for us to join our forces together to make sure when we mobilize funding for climate finance, part of it goes to support in building the capacity of African countries, but also providing the premium financing it requires for risk transfer. I wish you a great success in your discourse, and I look forward to the next step after this meeting, so we can continue to join our forces and make Africa more resilient while we adapt to the effect of climate change.
Muchas gracias al señor Cheikh Dione por su convincente mensaje. Esta formulación que nos comparte hace clara referencia a la relevancia de reelaborar los sistemas financieros para tener en cuenta el costo real del riesgo e incentivar su reducción y la creación de resiliencia. Se debe de planificar en todos los sectores para aumentar el uso eficiente de los recursos limitados y reducir las causas subyacentes del riesgo. Una de las posibilidades que existe para reconocer tanto las causas subyacentes como los factores inductores del riesgo y de los desastres es la investigación forense de desastres. Abordar las causas subyacentes y los impulsores de la vulnerabilidad y de la exposición reduce el riesgo y contribuye al desarrollo sostenible. Sin duda, la labor del Grupo de Capacidades del Riesgo en África ha demostrado la importancia de poner el financiamiento del riesgo a disposición de las comunidades vulnerables para construir sistemas alimentarios sostenibles y resilientes. Ahora tengo el gusto de presentar al primero de nuestros panelistas. Connor Seil es psicólogo político y asesor estratégico senior de One Earth Future, una ONG que trabaja para desarrollar la buena gobernanza y la consolidación de la paz. Parte de su trabajo en One Earth Future es desarrollar enfoques de estrategia que aborden el papel de los sesgos y el corto plazo en los sistemas globales. Es el autor y coordinador principal del capítulo 7 del GAR 2022, cómo los sesgos humanos y los procesos de decisión afectan los resultados de la reducción de riesgos. Es un firme defensor de la vinculación de la salud conductual en casos de desastre con la gobernabilidad y la consolidación de la paz. Sin más preámbulos, escuchemos a nuestro primer panelista distinguido. Thank you, Claude.
Thank you. When the banking crash of the late 2000s caused significant harm to the country of Iceland, the government of Iceland established a commission to investigate how it was that that country's economy had become so entangled in what were, in retrospect, extremely risky investments. This commission concluded that, among many causes, one cause of this disaster was a culture of short-term gain and an unwillingness to investigate the foundations of what were providing short-term wealth. More than a decade later, speaking in an entirely separate disaster context, Dr. Ashish Jha reflected on the enormous, preventable death toll due to COVID-19 in the United States and concluded, we got the medical science right. We failed in the social science. These two examples illustrate together the need for disaster risk reduction systems to take into account issues of how humans make decisions about risk. That is, how we seek out information, who we trust and who we listen to, and how we make and execute risk reduction decisions. This latter issue is important because the process of risk reduction decision-making is a multi-step process. People must be aware that a risk exists. They must decide that they are concerned about that risk and that there is something that they can personally do, and they must choose and execute that course of behavior. This means that awareness of risk is not sufficient in itself to lead to risk reduction behavior. Instead, there is a process that must be followed, linking each step from risk awareness through execution. This is significant because at each step of this process, the pressures and biases that influence human decision-making may influence whether a decision is made, how it is made, and whether it is carried out. When I say biases and pressures, these refer to the well-known and well-described conversation about heuristics, the thinking fast and thinking slow discussion, or the split between the careful, rational analysis of risk decision-making that happens when people are focused and concerned about an issue, versus the more rapid, unconscious, less thought-through decision-making that we engage in most situations. However, these pressures on decision-making also include issues of social motives, or things that we as humans seek from our social environment. A sense of social regularity, a sense that we are valued, a sense of connection to others and other things. These biases and motives exert persistent pressures on the risk decision-making process that means that we as humans may not make decisions or execute decisions which minimize systemic or even personal risk. The challenge for disaster risk reduction, or one of several challenges, is to incorporate this awareness into systems for disaster risk reduction, communication, and planning. As a part of this, governance institutions must examine issues of bias in their own systems of information seeking and incorporation. All too often, current systems for decision-making do not take into account local and indigenous values and knowledge in the design and decision-making process. Increasing the breadth of information brought into systems for decision-making planning and risk reduction can improve disaster risk reduction, and developing systems for risk reduction decision-making and communication that are based in the values and knowledge of the people affected will help DRR processes with the communities who need to be engaged, will help align DRR processes with the communities that need to be engaged. The key theme of the GAR, or one of the key themes of the GAR, is a call to plan with, not against, how people make decisions about risk. By developing bias-informed approaches to DRR planning, institutions can develop plans for DRR actions and communications that attach to the values, norms, and behaviors that authentically meet the need of local communities and align with biases that affect human behavior. When this is done, the result may be more rapid uptake and behavioral change. Where can we show examples of where this has worked? Well, in the current system, many of these examples come from a group working down one area, realizing that it's not working, and redeveloping their approach, because this is still an emerging area of research. But one example we can point to is the IFRC's work on Ebola in West Africa. The IFRC worked with local governments to support safe and dignified burials to stop the transmission of Ebola. The earliest engagement around that was focused on recommendations which were technically accurate. They represented the correct way to work on safe and dignified burials to break the transmission. However, these recommendations did not align with local traditions and values about how to treat the dead with respect. And as a result, in a confusing and fragmented information environment, people were receiving different information from different sources. The result was suspicion of these recommendations, distrust of the healthcare workers, and in some cases even violence against healthcare teams and secret burials. The IFRC realized what was happening, took a step back, and worked with local communities to develop new approaches to safe and dignified burials, which accorded with how local traditions expected treatment of the dead. This led to more uptake and a successful break in the transmission of Ebola. Now, this can be heard or told as a story about the international community working and failing to do good local engagement. But the point I want to make here is that these issues are relevant regardless of whether you're working in your own community or across different cultures, because issues of values, biases, the social needs that we bring to the table can arise in a variety of different contexts. One example is illustrated in Australia, where a wildlife fire mitigation program found itself embroiled in unexpected controversy because one of the recommendations that was made around wildlife clearance ran directly against passionately held values of some parts of the local community for preserving the native ecosystem. As a result, the technical recommendation found itself embroiled in a values-based conflict, which led to much more debate and distortion of the discussion than was anticipated. Any group doing DRR, even in our own backyard, can benefit from thinking through what potential issues of identity, values, and distortions from short-term thinking or optimism biases may be implicated in our work. So what lessons can be learned from this? Well, there is no universal solution because the specifics of each recommendation will be driven by the specifics of that context, the local values and the dynamics of the specific risk. However, generally, we can say that DRR plans should start with the assumption that risk awareness does not directly imply risk reduction behaviors will take place. This means that risk analysis and risk communication is a useful tool, but not in itself a panacea. Instead, Risk reduction planning and communication will be affected by issues including what competing information is available and who is it from, what values and identity issues are implicated in the requested behavioral change, and how does the recommended change interact with core social motives. Addressing these issues requires DRR planning and communication to map the communities of interest implicated in DRR work and engage with these communities early in the process in a genuinely collaborative approach to develop specific approaches and recommendations for DRR practices embedded in local systems and local needs. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a nuestro colega Connor Seil. Muy interesante la visión que nos da del mundo de la toma de decisiones desde la perspectiva psicológica. El entender la dicotomía entre dos modos de pensamiento, uno consciente y lógico y otro automático, instintivo, emocional, tiene implicaciones fundamentales que determinan la manera de actuar y comportarse. En dicho tenor, en el ámbito institucional, se debe dar atención a la toma interna de decisiones, los sesgos existentes y los aspectos que se valoran. Ello conlleva que el proceso de toma de decisiones para la reducción del riesgo de desastres requiere entender perspectivas sociales que son modeladas a través de valores y conocimientos, entre las cuales también se debe considerar de manera muy particular las ópticas locales e indígenas. Ahora tengo el placer de presentar a nuestra segunda panelista, la señora Mandisa Kalako Williams, quien se une a nosotros desde la República de Sudáfrica, donde es facilitadora independiente en desarrollo comunitario y organizacional. La señora Kalako Williams tiene experiencia en la supervisión de inversiones sociales corporativas, gestión de desastres, gobernanza organizacional de recaudación de fondos, gestión de género y diversidad en el sector corporativo, gubernamental y no gubernamental. De 2000 a 2010 se desempeñó como presidenta y secretaria general de la Sociedad de la Cruz Roja Africana. A nivel internacional se ha desempeñado en numerosos comités y grupos de trabajo para desarrollar la estrategia para la prevención de la violencia en la Federación Internacional de la Cruz Roja y ha participado en sesiones y debates de la ONU y la OMS acerca de este tema. Mandisa, you have the floor.
Thank you, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to talk about something slightly uncomfortable. In the 1990s, when we all saw the world crumbling under heavy disasters and the International Decade of Natural Disaster Reduction was declared, there was a fashionable word, community. It was involvement of the community, engagement, empowerment. Those were really top of the mind. All of these and the many other strategies that followed, you call it the frameworks, the Hyogo framework, research, surveys, conferences, global forums, platforms like the one we're in, MDGs, SDGs. In the center was the community, in our words. But I sit here and I look around and I'm saying, where's the community? Where is the influence of the community on our decisions? And who has listened and learned from their reality, their experiences and indigenous knowledge? We always write about them. By now, we understand that disasters cannot be separated from the inequalities, poverty, exclusion, segregation, and structural problems that are deeply ingrained in our societies. We are also painfully aware that our poorest and most marginalized communities are exposed to risk and disaster. They are at the forefront of disaster impacts, and among those, women, girls, young boys, the elderly, people with disabilities, and the frail. Those carry the heaviest burden. These groups have no say or influence on the crucial decisions that negatively affect their very survival when it comes to DRR. Yet we're talking today of making sure that no one is left behind. Tragically, because of their multifaceted roles and cultural responsibilities, women volunteers, mothers, grannies, and so on, they face a triple-edged sword when the COVID pandemic hit their colleagues, their siblings, took their children, and the communities where they are looked upon as the first responders. Their own fear of infection, their depression and anxiety about their loved ones and friends was sometimes overlooked because everybody expected them to be strong and render humanitarian services. The same happened when communities had to evacuate their villages, facing floods, fires, mudslides. Women hesitated to abandon the people that had been left in their care because that is how women are cultured around being carers, nurturers, lovers, nurses, teachers. Yet, at another level, the GAR2022, supported by global data on progress towards the SDGs, shows that violence against women is correlated to disaster impact, meaning that when a disaster strikes, in addition to dealing with losses and damage, women are also at heightened risk to fall victim of gender-based violence. Yet we continue to talk, sometimes in very sophisticated language, about making this a better world for all, while, and I quote myself in saying, while leaving large chunks of them outside these discussions. So something must change. Something's got to break. In this era of rampant climate change, pandemics, escalating wars, and general violence, we need to very seriously revisit the following. We must get closer to communities at risk, to go and listen, to go and learn from their knowledge and experiences, rather than aiming only at teaching them, modernizing them, politicizing them, making them better people. We have to listen to them. We must lighten, pardon me. We must lighten or simplify our language. Sometimes we go to places and use very technical terms, and my grandmother, if she was still alive, would not know what we were talking about. Our messages need to be community user-friendly. The knowledge from different disciplines and communities of non-academic actors must be integrated to adopt transdisciplinary approaches to strengthen the co-production of knowledge and to translate it into practical action with the community. We must address the link between vulnerability and exposure to disasters, the underlying drivers, for instance, the inequalities, the poverty, as well as local organizational dynamics and cultural stereotypes. Women may not do this, men cannot be seen carrying water, all those kinds of things that actually make our communities more vulnerable than they actually are. Through cooperation, private and public partnerships, and those would be among governments, corporate sector, affected communities, we can better tackle the root causes of disaster risk. Sometimes the silos that we work in create confusion because a community sees more than 7 different agents. It's UNICEF, it's Red Cross, it's government, it's that church, it's that church. And by the end of the day, people do not know who exactly they are listening to, instead of those entities coming together and then going to the community as one strong force that wants to work with and not for the community. We must broaden and humanize the access of people to the labor market. As the pandemic has stripped many of income, dignity, and livelihoods, and it has adversely affected health, welfare, and food security. A lot of people lost jobs. In my country, people had to rely on food parcels, and you and I know that food parcels are not something that you want to carry on without your dignity being affected adversely. We must hold the leadership, that is governments, corporate sector, and the communities themselves. We must hold these entities accountable for prudent use of humanitarian aid resources. This disappearance of aid is totally non-negotiable. Corruption must be confronted and dealt with decisively if we do not want to fail those who need our assistance and support the most. It is the right thing to do. We cannot stick to the rhetoric of yesterday's solutions. Oh, we used to do it in this fashion and invariably it's going to work this time as well. These disasters are changing their face and their impact on how we do our work. If we do not all, and I mean all, act now, there may be no tomorrow to fight or be happy about. And history will judge us very harshly. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, señora Mandisa. Thank you very much, Mandisa. Lógicamente, no debemos olvidar que los desastres no pueden separarse de las desigualdades, la pobreza, la marginación y la segregación. El desastre global desencadenado por la COVID-19 nos ha dejado claro que si no se atienden los problemas estructurales asociados con las causas de fondo y los impulsores del riesgo desde lo local hasta lo global, las consecuencias de los desastres serán inconcebibles. Debemos entrar asimismo en una era de aceptación de responsabilidades y corresponsabilidades, así como de una puesta en marcha de mecanismos institucionales orientados a la rendición de cuentas. El papel de las comunidades en la reducción del riesgo de desastres es insustituible y debe cristalizarse del discurso a la práctica. Ahora quiero aprovechar este espacio para recordarles a los participantes que nos pueden enviar sus preguntas para los integrantes del panel a través del cuadro de preguntas y respuestas y también usando la plataforma Slido. El código de nuestra sesión para que podamos interactuar es el 1326714. Repito, 1326714. Muchas gracias. Ahora tengo el gran gusto de presentarles a Claudia Herrera Melgar. Ella es la primera mujer en la historia de ocupar el cargo de secretaria ejecutiva del Centro de Coordinación para la Prevención de Desastres en Centroamérica y República Dominicana, el CEPREDENAC, cargo que ostenta desde el 1 de enero del 2019. Ella formó parte del equipo responsable de la armonización de la política centroamericana para la gestión integral del riesgo de desastres en el marco de SENDAI, coordinando la participación de CEPREDENAC con el Comité Ejecutivo del Sistema de Integración Centroamericana SICA, entidades gubernamentales, sistemas nacionales, cooperación internacional y con los actores estratégicos vinculados a la reducción del riesgo de desastres hasta lograr su aprobación en la Cumbre de Presidentes y Jefes de Estado del SICA en 2017. Adelante, Claudia, el micrófono es tuyo.
Muy buenas tardes. Es un enorme placer estar como representante del Centro de Coordinación para la Prevención de los Desastres en América Central, compartiendo los avances significativos que hemos desarrollado en relación a la gobernanza del riesgo, así como también los retos y los desafíos a los que nos enfrentamos. Como saben, tenemos una política centroamericana, ya lo comentaba, que fue armonizada con el marco de Sendai y que fue ratificada por los jefes de Estado de nuestros países, lo cual vuelve vinculante al marco de Sendai para nuestros países. Nosotros somos la instancia especializada dentro del sistema de la integración centroamericana a cargo de la gestión integral de riesgo y adaptación al cambio climático y contribuimos al cumplimiento de la agenda estratégica regional. Nuestra política centroamericana de gestión integral de riesgo constituye el marco orientador en materia de gestión de riesgo para nuestros países, pero también ha generado un valor agregado muy significativo que ha logrado incidir para que otros marcos orientadores y otras políticas a nivel regional puedan asumir los compromisos que se han evidenciado o que se han plasmado en esta política, como lo es la política regional universitaria, la política regional de igualdad y equidad de género, la política cultural, el marco estratégico de cambio climático y gestión de riesgos, entre otros. Estos esfuerzos que estamos desarrollando a nivel del sistema de la integración centroamericana es con la mirada para poder desarrollar procesos de desarrollo integral sostenibles y resilientes. Y en ese esfuerzo que estamos impulsando, estamos buscando la manera de generar mayor intersectorialidad a nivel regional, pero garantizando que estas estrategias políticas puedan también llegar a los planos nacionales. Es por eso que cada una de nuestras instancias a nivel nacional tiene su política nacional de gestión integral de riesgo armonizada con nuestra política regional, sus planes de emergencia, sus planes de contingencia, todo lo que tiene que ver con la política centroamericana. Igualmente, nuestra política va enfocada en la prevención del riesgo, con un enfoque de gestión prospectiva del riesgo. En ese sentido, hemos incorporado ejes estratégicos para la inversión pública y privada, para el desarrollo social y la compensación, para vincular también la temática de gestión integral de riesgo con cambio climático, así como la gobernabilidad y la gobernanza en gestión integral de riesgo, los procesos de respuesta a las emergencias, recuperación, reconstrucción y resiliencia. En esos esfuerzos hemos venido impulsando estas articulaciones intersectoriales, pero sobre todo, como lo marca nuestro objetivo central, de identificar las potencialidades de nuestras comunidades, vinculando a organizaciones de sociedad civil para garantizar que el enfoque de derechos, el enfoque de inclusión, de igualdad y la participación comunitaria sea incorporada en las acciones nacionales. Es por eso que hemos identificado la necesidad de articular esfuerzos con organizaciones de base y tenemos tremendas experiencias de cómo se ha empoderado y hemos dado una vinculación muy efectiva a nivel comunitario, como ya lo han señalado, de esa importancia de bajar desde lo regional hasta lo comunitario y que no perdamos de vista el por qué estamos aquí reunidos, para atender esa población que está cada vez más expuesta y más vulnerable y es la que sufre las consecuencias de los desastres. Realmente tenemos que reconocer el escenario complejo que nos ha tocado enfrentar en Centroamérica. Desde el 2020, al inicio de la pandemia del COVID-19, hemos tenido años sin precedentes, una situación sumamente compleja ante la ocurrencia de eventos extremos, múltiples eventos de menor intensidad, pero en un corto periodo de tiempo que han dejado secuelas e impactos económicos y sociales negativos en nuestra población y en nuestro desarrollo. Es por eso que hemos redoblado estos esfuerzos para generar mayor articulación. Nuestra región se encuentra aún afectada por la consecuencia de la pandemia y por estos eventos. Solamente en el 2020 fuimos afectados por alrededor de 30 eventos hidrometeorológicos que dejaron un impacto económico significativo y una contracción del Producto Interno Bruto de alrededor de 7.4%. Esto se estima que pueda generar una contracción y un retroceso de 2 a 8 años en términos del Producto Interno Bruto de nuestra región. Ante esa magnitud de los impactos que enfrenta nuestra región y sobre todo la persistencia de escenarios de riesgo complejos, porque lamentablemente nuestra región está expuesta a múltiples amenazas y a ese incremento de la vulnerabilidad del cambio climático, lo que hace necesario que sigamos redoblando esfuerzos y articulando esfuerzos. Por eso es importante este tipo de diálogos para que podamos compartir experiencias y también las fortalezas y que podamos generar mayores oportunidades. Hemos desarrollado también muchos esfuerzos sobre la anticipación, la prevención y la prevención. En esa aceptación que ya nos recordaba Iracema, de esa aceptación generalizada de que el hecho de que los desastres no son naturales, que existe una relación directa entre el riesgo y los desastres y que los procesos de desarrollo sesgados o incompletos generan factores de riesgo, ha llevado también a la confirmación de que la intervención y la acción destinada a reducir y controlar los riesgos son posibles. Las etapas donde se llamaban los ciclos de desastres, en el que un desastre era el punto central, pero que no se consideraba con su vínculo en el desarrollo, han sido reemplazadas en nuestra región y está evidenciado en nuestra política centroamericana de gestión integral de riesgo. Y enfatiza la necesidad de que las intervenciones estén centradas en el riesgo, en ese riesgo continuo y sobre todo en el enfoque que se centra en la idea de que los enfoques deben ser correctivos, reactivos, compensatorios y prospectivos en la gestión integral de riesgo. Y es por eso que la generación de resiliencia, la construcción de una Centroamérica más resiliente y más segura es una de nuestras prioridades. Para que nuestros países puedan tener mayor capacidad de resistir, de responder en esa gestión sostenible y sensible al riesgo con un enfoque sistémico, está plasmado en nuestro objetivo de la política. Sobre todo con ese crecimiento constante del riesgo de desastres que nos lleva a que cada vez estemos más expuestos y más vulnerables y al aumento del grado de exposición de nuestra población. Es por eso que la importancia, esta sesión la llamamos desempacando el Regional Assessment Report y para nosotros es una gran herramienta que nos ha permitido llegar a hacer incidencia a nivel de las reuniones de los jefes de Estado, reuniones ministeriales, porque esto nos da los elementos sustanciales para poder hacer esa incidencia a nivel político y evidenciar que los procesos de desarrollo deben incorporar la gestión integral de riesgo, sobre todo en regiones tan expuestas y tan vulnerables como lo es nuestra región. Estamos realizando procesos que contribuyen a ese desarrollo e incidiendo para que la temática de gestión integral de riesgo y adaptación al cambio climático sea incorporada dentro de la agenda de desarrollo del sistema de la integración centroamericana y es un compromiso que se ha asumido desde cada uno de nuestros gobiernos buscando esa construcción de resiliencia. Pero no debemos obviar que tenemos que ir identificando cuáles son esas vulnerabilidades, cuáles son esas necesidades específicas, sobre todo de la población vulnerable, población indígena, las mujeres, las poblaciones con discapacidad y en este esfuerzo que tenemos que hacer para continuar con la creación de instrumentos jurídicos y marcos orientadores desde el abordaje intersectorial y generando esa articulación de multiactores para una coordinación más efectiva y sobre todo para que busquemos complementar esfuerzos a través de alianzas estratégicas que yo creo que es un reto que compartimos a nivel global. Muchísimas gracias por esta oportunidad nuevamente.
Muchas gracias, Claudia. Reducir y evitar la construcción del riesgo, atendiendo los procesos de desarrollo, como bien señala, son retos significativos, no solo en Centroamérica, sino en todas las regiones del mundo. Uno de los desafíos evidentes involucran transitar de los enfoques reactivos y de la respuesta de emergencia a enfoques preventivos, multiescala, fundamentados en la gestión prospectiva del riesgo, en los que las estrategias se confeccionen alrededor de los seres humanos y con una visión de largo plazo. Por ello, el desarrollo de la planificación, tanto en zonas rurales, urbanas, periurbanas, montañosas, costeras, etcétera, debe de tener un enfoque de gestión integral del riesgo y esto es inaplazable. Por ello, el desarrollo nos va a permitir evitar, el desarrollo informado nos va a permitir evitar la construcción de nuevos riesgos y es también de suma relevancia contar con estrategias que tengan el objetivo de realizar la caracterización del riesgo, especialmente la identificación de los diversos niveles de exposición y vulnerabilidad, con el objetivo de fomentar procesos de recuperación integrales. Bueno, pues ahora vamos a dar paso a nuestra sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Hemos recibido aquí algunas preguntas. La primera de ellas es para Mandisa Calaco Williams. The first question is for you, Mandisa. And they are asking, a colleague of us is asking, how can communities be empowered to become more resilient? And what can the public sector do to support this? And you have 2 minutes to answer the question. Thank you very much.
The public sector employs people from communities. It is in the interest of the public sector to say, now we need to make their lives better so that even when they come to work, they are in good health. Communities themselves have had coping mechanisms which we have ignored because we wanted to be donor happy and give them things rather than say, let's work together to build this. And you cannot come in a helicopter to a community. You've got to come from within and build within the community. So communities are not those foreign animals sitting in a different world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have another question here. It says, what are your major recommendations how to address complexity of risk on the one hand and the need for a simple language on risk reduction on the other? Who would like to answer this question? Rama?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is a hard question because the complexity of risk is derived from the fact that we have very different contexts in which risk is created. And vulnerabilities, as Mandisa was saying, is embedded in communities and the relationship between communities, natural resources, and governments. So having a universal language is useful at the high level to explain principles, but in practice, we have to derive from what's happening in the context, because risk is created by social and economic processes. It is not necessarily created by a whole range of things that come from the outside. So we need a framework, and I think UNDRR and the GARs have given us a risk framework to deal with that. But in complex emerging systems where many things interact, like we've seen in the case of COVID, using a one-size-fits-all mechanism for dealing with it is deeply problematic. As we've seen in many countries across the world, some have used very different mechanisms for dealing with COVID. But at the base of this, we have to reduce vulnerability and exposure at the floor, which basically means that sustainable development has to be implemented for everybody. If you're able to do that, the source for much of our risk will actually be dealt with. And then finally, there are a whole range of economic and social processes that derive from the global system that have to be looked at very carefully, and our communities, our governments, and the private sector have to take equal share in trying to make sure we can address those questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Omar. We have now a question in Spanish for Claudia. ¿Cómo vincular la competitividad sostenible en políticas de reducción de riesgo a la sociedad, gobiernos y los económicos locales para la toma de decisiones?
Creo que es importante partir de un conocimiento o una práctica y del ejercicio de acciones concretas. No podemos gestionar el riesgo que no conocemos, entonces debemos de ampliar el conocimiento del riesgo y esa exposición a la vulnerabilidad de todos los actores para que compartamos metas y objetivos vinculados a la gestión integral de riesgo y que haya un entendimiento de esa intrínseca relación de los desastres con los procesos de desarrollo y el impacto sobre todo que tiene en nuestras comunidades esas afectaciones. Es por eso que es trascendental que busquemos la forma que las políticas, los planes y los marcos orientadores jurídicos puedan trasladarse a acciones concretas y esto de la única manera que lo podemos lograr es identificando esas necesidades diferenciadas, esa exposición, ese análisis de contexto que nos hablaba Connor y ver desde esa visión de cada una de las comunidades cuáles son las consecuencias del riesgo y los desastres en sus propias vidas, el desplazamiento, la pobreza, la migración, todas esas consecuencias que ellos están realmente afectándose cada vez de manera más terrible en cada una de las comunidades. Entonces es importante que identifiquemos esa exposición, esa vulnerabilidad, pero que vayamos de la mano trabajando con las comunidades para definir planes de recuperación, generando la construcción de resiliencia y también una cultura de prevención y dándole a las comunidades y a los gobiernos locales los mecanismos para poder lograr esa resiliencia.
Muchas gracias, Claudia. Now we have a question for Connor. Connor, do you think present global institutional system is capable of dealing with known pandemics like COVID? If not, what are the changes required?
I think the global system is capable because we have seen many examples of diseases which had pandemic risk, but which were effectively addressed. I think the fundamental challenge with many of these complex systems is the old problem of the defender. We have to be lucky every time. The disease or the disaster only has to be lucky once. And that underscores the need for systems which are complex, which are engaged across multiple different issues, which have multiple lines of defense, and which engage authentically, as we've been talking about it, in a differentiated fashion with the different communities and institutions involved. But is it possible? Yes, I think that there are many examples of successful, sustainable prevention of disasters in a variety of different contexts that we can point to. The challenge is making those systemic, sustainable, and enduring over time. Because, of course, as COVID-19 has shown us, even a small gap in the system can lead to fairly significant outcomes.
Thank you very much, Connor. Now we go back to Mandisa, and there is a question for you. Could you please give best example of community engagement in true sense from your work experience?
Yes, I could, but you would have to sit here until tomorrow. When you are a child growing up, it is a community that brings you up. Your value systems are therefore built around that. If you go to community B, you know exactly which entry. 1992 drought in the eastern part of South Africa called the Transkei. We went in and we thought we were very good because we were going to build and make sure that people don't use dirty water. We were going to drill for them. And on the day that that happened, we thought the meeting was very well attended. We had an engineer from Umtata. And when we got there, the man of that village said, "We are not here to help you do this. We are here to ask, why did you talk to our wives without consulting us?" So it was a lesson to say your entry point in any village has got to be culturally sensitive. You cannot walk into a place and say, "We are bringing the resources, you can't complain." Secondly, when there was the tsunami in these parts of the world, Banda Aceh, those areas, the farmers in South Africa said, we are going to send meal, and my minister said, "Mandisa, what do we do?" I said, "We don't send meal to a country whose eating habits we are not familiar with. Those people have got their cultural food." And the farmers, because they were powerful, said, "No, when they are hungry, they will take it." I said, at no risk, because those things will rot at the harbor. So it is sensitivity to the cultural dynamics, and it is also your ability to be humble, to go into a house of a poor person and take away the camera, take away the cleverness, and sit down on the floor if that's what it takes.
Wonderful answer. Thank you very much, Mandisa. I have a question, a very nice one for Aromar. Can achieving the SDGs be compatible with the perpetuation of a consumerist economic system based on competition for short-term profits and unlimited growth?
Good question. This was debated very strongly, I think, when the SDGs were framed in the General Assembly. And that's the reason why we have an SDG on 12, which is about sustainable production and consumption. It's not a very strong SDG, and many people don't actually look at it very carefully, but it's the heart, I think, of the system. We cannot achieve the end of poverty without looking at equity, both in its economic sense, which is SDG 10, and its a gender sense, which you heard very clearly just now. And if you look at these three things together, it effectively means that we have to choose and understand not only how much should we have, but how much is enough. And this is exactly the story as far as we're concerned on the climate front. If we have to achieve net zero, or even if we have to peak emissions in this decade, it basically means that some of us will have to actually dramatically change our lifestyles and our styles of consumption. This is backed by the best evidence that we have. One of the most important things that we found in the IPCC, which was just produced a few weeks ago, was that we can reduce up to 70% of global emissions by actually changing the ways that we eat, the kind of things that we drive around in, and the lifestyles that we have. This is not an easy thing to do, because like Mandisa was saying just now, our identities are often our lives in some senses. So we have to really try and understand what it means to build solidarity within countries and regions, across countries. And I think this is why a gathering like this is really very, very important. This is an old saying that comes from Gandhi, and that is, there is enough in the world for every person's need. We have enough food, we have enough water, we have pretty much all the medicines we require, but there's not enough in the world for even a few people's greed. But unfortunately, the system is highly unequal, and during the period of COVID, we have seen inequalities rise and not fall.
Thank you very much. Now we have another question for Connor. Connor, what role could user-centered design, behavioral insights, behavioral economics play in DRR? Where is it done well?
Sure. Well, all three of those approaches, user-centered design, behavioral science, behavioral insights, these approaches, these are very good examples of approaches which attempt to work with what we know about how humans make decisions. I think that they are one specific approach to how we think about behavioral science and what that means. It's embedded in a specific kind of nudge framework built on the biases and heuristics-based work. But I think that there are some fairly strong examples of how you can create systems which make the default behavior the desired behavior. And when it comes to disaster risk reduction, I think that there are certainly applications of this. It's going to be more or less relevant depending on the specific disaster you're talking about. But I think that, well, just for one example, the way that this event has been designed to encourage masking, to make it something which is both requested, but also a question of a social norm. I think that issues such as that, marrying the formal request with the socialization of a specific practice, can do more to promote behavior change than something which relies only on traditional enforcement mechanisms or things like that. So I think that there are a lot of people exploring how these approaches work, and I think there's an enormous amount that can be done with it. The Secretary General has focused on behavioral science as a topic for the United Nations to develop, and I think it's something that is being thought through. However, I would also encourage people who are interested in this to remember that the behavioral sciences are broader than just those specific approaches. And there are insights from anthropology, from sociology, from social psychology, which invite questions about culture, social practices, and other aspects than the more limited focus of the behavioral economics models. And I would encourage folks interested in this to explore a diversity of ways of thinking about behavioral science in developing these interventions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Connor. Now we have a question for Claudia. Claudia, despite the objectives of the Sendai framework to substantially reduce the number of disasters, risks are on the rise. Is the Sendai framework up to speed? What needs to change?
Creo que es importante que tenemos que redoblar los esfuerzos. Realmente creo que de acuerdo a lo que se está avanzando, que si en lugar de dudas son avances significativos, no son suficientes. Si comparamos con la realidad que nuestras comunidades están enfrentando, con los obstáculos que nuestros propios gobiernos están también enfrentando en relación a su propio desarrollo, destinando los recursos que deberían de estar orientados para procesos de desarrollo y de educación, de la parte de salud, y que se están destinando únicamente a la respuesta a las emergencias, y también con esa consideración de que esa respuesta a las emergencias se basa únicamente en la mera asistencia humanitaria y no se están desarrollando esfuerzos para caracterizar el riesgo post-desastre, y estamos generando nuevos escenarios de riesgo, incrementando la exposición y la vulnerabilidad y no reduciendo los riesgos existentes. Si seguimos en ese camino, va a ser muy difícil. Yo me atrevería a decir que imposible que alcancemos el logro de los objetivos de desarrollo sostenibles. Por eso que es trascendental e imperativo que la gestión integral de riesgo y la adaptación al cambio climático sea asumido bajo todos los procesos de desarrollo, en un enfoque de resiliencia, un enfoque de seguridad, pero sobre todo que atendamos esas necesidades específicas de nuestras comunidades y que tengamos la voz siempre de nuestras comunidades y de nuestras personas que tienen condiciones de mayor vulnerabilidad.
Muchas gracias, Claudia. Now we have another question for Mandisa. Mandisa, do you think that the digital online world that was created by the pandemic could be used to increase inclusion in addressing risks with communities? The digital and online world, yes.
I actually think so. Because remember, every grandmother has a cell phone. In my village, they call them dilili, very low function kind of telephone. They have grandchildren who go to school and learn about these things. The mistake we make is when we cut the rest of mankind out, when we do not put them into the picture. When, for instance, we're talking now digital, but the very first few information bursts on COVID were in English, and they were on television, and rural people did not have any of those. So it is in breaking that, or rather linking that digital presence with people's humble way of living and saying to them, if you touch here, this will come out. If you touch there. But now what we do, we completely run away with it and come back with them and say, if you don't want to comply, I'm going to send the soldiers. They will teach you how to behave. You have already lost that community. I don't know if I'm answering you.
Thank you very much. Now we have the last question for all our panelists, and this is, can you give an example of how the recently released Global Assessment Report could be used by people in this room to guide transformative change in practice? Who would like to answer this question? No one. Claudia,
bueno,
thank you.
Sí me atrevo. Que nadie ve. Bueno, para nosotros, como lo señalaba anteriormente, ha sido una herramienta muy eficaz. La estamos utilizando para hacer los procesos de incidencia al más alto nivel. En nuestra próxima cumbre de presidentes que se va a llevar a cabo en junio de este año, es uno de los temas estratégicos que se va a abordar, y la evidencia tanto técnica como científica que se evidencia en el RAR y que se ha generado también con otros acuerdos que tenemos con instancias como por ejemplo la aplicación del índice de gobernabilidad en políticas públicas, marcos de recuperación, los análisis de early recovery que estamos desarrollando, todo eso nos da los elementos sustanciales para fundamentar la necesidad y sobre todo la imperativa necesidad de que generemos procesos de reconstrucción seguros y sostenibles. En esa relación también, en esa utilización del RAR para nuestra región específicamente, nos permitió lograr más bien que en la pasada cumbre de presidentes de Costa Rica pudiésemos tener 6 antecedentes o 6 justificativos vinculados a la gestión integral de riesgo y adaptación al cambio climático y 2 acuerdos presidenciales que nos permiten ir generando este tipo de iniciativas, esta articulación de esfuerzos, pasar de un enfoque preventivo, pasar de un enfoque reactivo a un enfoque preventivo e ir generando estos procesos de articulación multisectorial y con multiactores. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Claudia. Ahora tengo el placer de invitar a nuestro orador principal y panelistas a dar en un minuto sus reflexiones finales sobre las principales conclusiones y recomendaciones. Y vamos a dar inicio con Aromar Revi. Please.
Thank you so much. I'll just pick up on the last question and try and make this a little concrete. In the last 2 years, I think everybody in this room and most of us across the world have experienced something that the GAR has really identified as a core question, and that is a question of complex and compounding risks. So we had a small event that happened, a couple of years ago in a small place in one part of the world. Most people, excepting of course for medical specialists and epidemiologists, never believed that we would have a global pandemic. There were various things that happened in various places. It was Ebola and a whole range of other things. But within a few weeks, we found that from a small place, because we have an interconnected world, not only in East Asia, but in other parts of the world, this is spread across the world. And effectively, it was not a crisis only of the health. It eventually, because of our responses, and many of us have come from countries which were completely locked down, it impacted employment because nothing was happening. It impacted poverty. It impacted food supplies. And it impacted healthcare and even other sectors. So what I'm saying is, this is an example of a classic Sdg crisis. It starts in one Sdg, Sdg 3, and then it spreads like a virus into pretty much everything else, into 1, which is poverty, 2, which is food security, 3, obviously, which is health, 4, education. In South Asia, there were hundreds of millions of school children that were out of school for 2 years because the schools were shut. Etc. So the only thing that seemed to improve in some senses was the environment, because there were less emissions and less other challenges as far as that's concerned. But even that has got limitations. So the reason I'm laying this out is, what we have seen and heard today is the question of the interconnection of many parts of the world, not only within countries, but between sectors and between multiple levels. It can start in one place, it can become a regional problem, can become a global problem simultaneously. So we have to address these questions systemically, right? And we knew what the answers were. Like Connor was saying just now, fairly quickly, because of the scientists across the world, including in East Asia, we were able to figure out what the problem was. We were able to figure out and really quickly create the vaccines. But the challenge was, in many parts of the world, even today, vaccines are not available. So we knew what the solutions were. But the systemic barriers to addressing this question in terms of human behavior, in terms of what was right to be done economically, was not clear. And even when we knew about it, there were particular views on what this virus was and what it was doing that was not able to be dealt with adequately. So this is, I think, a very interesting reflection for us. And the GAR speaks about it very critically. We have to address, and as we go forward, more and more of these challenges are going to be like this. I'm not saying the same thing will happen again. The world is too much of a complex place for that to happen, fine. But this is a wake-up call for us, not only for pandemics, but also economic recession, which we are facing as an outcome of that, conflict that comes from that, and the climate crisis, and behind that, the deeper and most critical biodiversity crisis. So we're going to see a series of succession of these waves. We know that they're sort of going to happen. We don't know where they'll start and how they actually work. We have to, in our own regional and cultural context, to be able to find systemic ways of doing this. And I think that is a power of Sendai, because Sendai builds from bottom up. But the fact is, we're living in a world which has got 8 billion people. It will have 10 billion in the future. And our risk exposure is dramatically increasing, and because of inequality. And the fact that we will actually maybe set back in terms of implementing the SDGs by, in some parts of the world, 5 years or 10 years, our vulnerability is actually increasing. If we're not able to reduce exposure, reduce vulnerability, and build the capacities that we have in our communities, in our governments, in our supply chains, and in our enterprises, we're going to be in quite a lot of trouble. So we know what many of the answers are. We have to start applying them really quickly in the current context that we're working in, and build that out, I would say, certainly in the rest of the decade. And if we do that, the world will certainly be a better place, because this is also about prosperity. It's also about protecting the environment. And it's also about equality, some things that I think nobody in the room or outside would actually debate about. But getting together and dealing with these apparent conflicts, these incentives that drive us and things that are not very rational, is not the easiest thing in the world. And I think a change in our mindset and our way of looking at these things would be very important. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Aroma. Now, Connor, 1 minute for your concluding remarks, please.
Very good. Thank you. I'm struck by themes that I hear across this panel, themes of localization, complexity, sustainability, themes that are not particularly new to the DRR conversation. These are calls that I think that have been around for a while. So one of my questions is, well, why are we not doing it already? And I think that one of the insights from behavioral science is that systems generate what is rewarded. And I think that this is a question that I would encourage us all to think about, is that if we acknowledge that these are the things that need to be done, are our systems set up to reward this? Are the incentives that we're given from funders, from our promotion boards or other elements set up to actually reinforce this or not? If not, what can we do to change this? Because I'm somewhat skeptical that until the inputs to the system are changed, the outcomes will be different. And I should acknowledge that in the interest of intellectual honesty, that my thinking about that was influenced by a conversation I had this morning with Lisa Robinson of BBC Action. So I would like to call that out as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Connor. Now, Mandisa, 1 minute for your conclusion, please. Thank you.
1.5, I'm the oldest of
That's
this panel.
perfect.
Words, I've just kept words. Silos. I do my thing. I keep my budget. I rule my community. Yet disasters work like this. So let's break the silos. Within our governments, let's not compete. Department with a budget for fixing roads, for building clinics, but everybody wants to go and build a clinic where there is no road. Why not combine the budgets and go and do one integrated, community satisfying activity? And ladies and gentlemen, whether we like it or not, the word corruption must leave our lives. You are not stealing from the government. You are not stealing from your corporate. You are stealing from the vulnerable people, and you are making them even more vulnerable. How do you sleep at night? There must be consequences. Actions must be taken. And finally, communities can take advantage of a weak management system. Once they see that you are not combined, you are not cooperating with one another, they'll take advantage. Why do we allow communities to build below the floodplain? Is it because their numbers are large and we get more political power for them voting for us? Or is it because there is something else, there are tenders to be given out? Do not fail to reinforce the laws. In my country, there was something called, long ago, the Land Use Ordinance. Bring it back, let people know that they cannot build in the wetlands. And if they build, there'll be consequences. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mandisa. Claudia, tu reflexión en un minuto, por favor.
que debemos de generar mayores condiciones para construir comunidades resilientes. Todos nuestros esfuerzos deben estar orientados para atender esas comunidades que están cada vez más expuestas y más vulnerables, pero desde una visión transformadora, desde una visión de que ellos pueden ser protagonistas de un cambio para sus comunidades, pero también para nuestros países, y ver también las posibilidades de reconstruir mejor, evitar las respuestas a las emergencias y reconstruir más bien esos mismos escenarios de riesgo y no reducir los riesgos existentes. Pasar también, insisto, para un enfoque preventivo, medidas anticipatorias y generar mayores sistemas de alerta temprana enfocados en los medios de vida, para que realmente identifiquemos acciones que estén orientadas a atender esas consecuencias del desarrollo en nuestras comunidades. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Claudia. Los desastres están transformando nuestra sociedad más rápido que nunca. Esto exige un compromiso conjunto de toda la sociedad hacia un cambio sociocultural en donde se establezca el papel central de la gestión integral del riesgo de desastres en la construcción del mundo que valoramos y deseamos. Si algo hemos aprendido es que no podemos elegir un camino de timidez ante los desastres. Para finalizar, me gustaría compartir con ustedes una frase de Marie Curie, quien decía que nada en la vida es para ser temido, es solo para ser comprendido. Ahora es el momento de entender más, de modo que podamos temer menos. Por lo tanto, desde el GAR, los invitamos a entender y abordar de manera integral el riesgo de desastres. Muchas gracias a nuestros oradores principales y panelistas, pero sobre todo muchas gracias a todos ustedes por compartir con nosotros este espacio en Bali y desde sus hogares y oficinas. Les agradecemos ahora, sean tan gentiles de por favor desocupar la sala, ya que el espacio ahora se preparará para la próxima sesión y se limita de acuerdo a las reglas de COVID-19. Recuerden consultar la agenda de la plataforma global para asegurarse de llegar a tiempo a su procesión. Muchas gracias a todos. Buenas tardes.